That's a classic.
Good afternoon and welcome to this very special and unusual book launch here, book discussion here at the Wilson Center, Gaming the World, How Sports Are Reshaping Global Politics and Culture by Andy Markovits, who I'll introduce in a few minutes. Before doing that, let me just say a few words about the Wilson Center. As many of you know, the Wilson Center was opened in 1968, and it was commissioned by Congress, like many of the other presidential memorials around town. This one, of course, in honor of President Woodrow Wilson. But as I like to say, unlike the marble ones, this one talks back. This is a living memorial to President Wilson. And in the spirit of his life and his accomplishments, the Wilson Center, the goal of the Wilson Center is to bring together scholars and researchers with public policymakers and politicians. And we try to create dialogue between people who do research and people who actually make policy. Sports is a somewhat unusual topic for both policymakers and for researchers, and yet it is, as I think our speakers today will make clear, one that really lies at the intersection of both academia and politics. The author of the book, Gaming the World, is Andrei Markovits, who's the Arthur Thurnau Professor and Karl Deutsch Collegiate Professor of Comparative Politics and German Studies at the University of Michigan. You have his bio in front of you, so I won't go through all of the details. But Andy has contributed. I've known him for many years, and it's really a great pleasure to have him here. He's contributed greatly to the study of comparative politics for many years, but his avocation has always been sports. And as long as I've known Andy, the two passions of his life have been, well, three: his dog, or his dogs, the Grateful Dead, and soccer. So this book brings together, allows him to bring his many scholarly talents and powers of analysis together with one of those passions, sports. And so you'll hear more about that later. Commenting on the book, we're very fortunate to have with us Franklin Foer, who's a political journalist and currently the editor of The New Republic, one of America's leading journals of politics and opinion. And like Andy, he combines both of scholarly and academic interest in political analysis with an interest in sports. And he's the author of a book, How Soccer Explains the World, an Unlikely Theory of Globalization. So today I think we're going to be treated to a very unusual and high-minded discussion of something that many of us simply enjoy, or in my case, as I was watching the World Cup this summer, try to figure out why everybody else is so busy enjoying it. Today we'll get many insights into the world of soccer and other sports. So please join me in welcoming Andy Markovits.
Sonia, it's a real pleasure to be here. The Yiddish term machaya comes to mind, which is sort of more than just pleasure. It really is almost like a kind of fulfillment. It's wonderful to see all these friends, former students, and to get to meet Frank again after so many years of course, reading him from afar and actually having met him just before he was on his way to writing his seminal book, meeting in Somerville, if you recall. And while I was at Harvard that year, and above all, also meeting Grant Wall, who is, again, in my book, one of the greats of sports and also of soccer. So let me very briefly delineate what this book is, which I co-authored with Lars Rensmann, who is our DAD professor of German studies and politics, but also, of course, a huge sports fan, what this book is trying to do. And it goes basically as such. The world has always known disparate games of all kinds. Every culture, as the great Dutch historian and sociologist Johan Huizinga in his brilliant book Homo Ludens delineates, it may be something about human life, or it's clearly a social issue. I would actually go, apropos Sonia and my love for dogs, but even primates, clearly dogs love to play, so do primates. And there's something obviously in the most disparate of human cultures that spawned games. And so, in fact, for example, one of the many precursors to soccer is the Roman game harpastum, which had sort of soccer-like or football-like characteristics. And this world of this disparate kind of world of these games was, of course, had no real written rules. It was basically spontaneous. It was local. The records we have of these are mainly from police records because they were often very violent, certainly in the Middle Ages. Indeed, to this day, some of these actually continue to this day. For example, the Shrovetide football between the Uppards and the Downards in Ashbourne in Derbyshire is still being played between these two teams of maybe 1,000 to a side. We don't quite know how many. But now it's kind of almost a sort of a touristic thing. What this world has actually left us is in the language, and you'll see to me these sports are languages, the language of soccer, it left us the legacy of the rivalry. To this day, everywhere is called derby or derby. So local rivalries, okay, or the classico for the Latins, meaning teams that are always close and where Freud's narcissism of the small difference pertains, where you hate the team next door, even though the differences might not be so stark. I always ask my students and tell them actually the difference between you and Ohio State students is not that profound, and I get all kinds of very, very, if looks could kill, maybe a couple of SAT points higher. So the point is that these things actually, the calciopatto, these things actually exist to some degree, but something changes in the post-Napoleonic era, and basically these disparate games become part of modern sports. And what I mean by this is that they become rule-bound, they become institutionalized I actually came to much of this by teaching some sports examples in my classes on Max Weber, namely to highlight issues of bureaucratization, institutionalization, written rules, continuity, thereby creating something that, of course, means intelligibility. It created what the Dutch sociologist Martin van Bottenburg calls sportization, meaning that you created literally the identity, the language that denotes tennis, and that everyone understands, 15, 30, 40 love. By the way, it's wonderful. I finally looked at why on earth is it called love. And of course, it's a kind of chalk it up to the odd hearing of the Brits because, of course, it was œuf, namely zero, or an egg. We also use that, they lay a goose egg. And of course, the Brits heard œuf, and it kind of became love. Okay, I never understood why zero was love. Anyway, but basically, between 1840 and 50 and the First World War, what we call the first period of globalization, a world emerged in which these languages established associations, established institutions, established leagues, established regularity, and in fact fought over the issue whether they're an avocation or a vocation. And this remains very important, I mean, the issue of professionalism versus amateurism. All the way until the basically the 80s in the Olympics, okay? I still remember Austria, one of the great moments in Austrian politics are actually all about sports. One of them was in 1968 when Karl Schranz was banned by Avery Brundage for actually being a professional because he stood on the with his skis and it said Kneißl on this. This was when Karl Schranz returned apparently in shame, to Vienna. In excess of 500,000 people saw him as this hero, all the way from Schwechat back to Vienna. So sports becomes actually everywhere an important political dimension. Very briefly, this world that I just delineated created a couple of, many global languages, but in particular one, namely that of association football, which is soccer in this part of the world. And by the way, please do not let any Brit kind of deride you for this being yet another kind of Yankee deformation of a sort of holy cultural trust. Okay? It is not an American term. It is not an American invention. It is as British as can be. It's actually a slang word of the Oxbridge students for whom association was too lengthy, and they abbreviated to soccer. Okay? So this particular code of football, as I actually, again, I won't have time for this, but basically argue that this is sort of like the Romance languages. They all have something in common, but they're actually slightly different. So there is American football and Canadian football and also Aussie rules football and association football and rugby league, and they're like Portuguese, Romanian, et cetera, which means you understand it a bit, but you actually don't. You certainly don't understand the poetry of it. You certainly don't understand its history. You don't understand its icons. You have to learn that. And this one particular code of football becomes hegemonic in two parts of the world, in Europe, in the continent, and in Latin America, by dint of Britain's economic might, okay, by dint of it being exported by engineers, by textile workers, by railroad workers, and so on and so forth. We can go into the discussion why this particular code became so successful, partly because the setup for it is very easy. The language, the grammar is not that difficult. But there are many other reasons. Suffice it to say that the United States actually is not part of this compact. And what I spent actually in an earlier book called Offside, arguing, kind of linking up with the famous Zombart question, why is there no socialism in America, which of course was actually erroneous when he wrote it, because of course there was no socialism in Europe either. What he should have asked was, why is there no large mass-based male industrial working class party in the United States? That's the question. Okay? He made it short, socialism. And I basically picked up on this and argued that the United States, in almost in a Tocquevillian way, created its own sports space, created its own sports languages that are related but also different from the rest of the world, in this case mainly Europe's. And just like the Zombardian question was highly Euro-centered, why is there no socialist America, and then linked to the debate about American exceptionalism, which my dear friend Jerome Carabel actually researched here this past year at Sonia's, at the Wilson Center, a large study about this. And again, exceptionalism now in an empirical way, not in a normative, which is always misinterpreted. It's not that America should be better, but America being different. So creates its own space. I will not have it. The story about Harvard is fascinating, how Harvard channels American football. Just very briefly, it has everything to do with prestige scales. When these games were still in their amorphous stage, Harvard, for its own historic reasons, and basically its Anglophilia, and also looking up to only Oxford and Cambridge, decides to opt out from the nascent football code, which was actually closer to soccer. So the Princeton-Rutgers game in November of 1869 is more like a soccer game. Harvard actually stays out of this, and it's great to read the Harvard Magenta, which never mentions Yale or Princeton. If you read the Princeton and the Yale publications, every second word is Harvard. Okay, so you can really see what they are trying to aim for. And then, of course, they hook up with the Oxford and Cambridge equivalent in North America called McGill, They fall in love with that game, end of story. And Harvard actually then by 1879, Michigan plays it, and it becomes part of the American bourgeois fall culture. All right. The point then is that this world existed pretty much, again, following a political science sociology article, a very famous one by the late Seymour Martin Lipset and Stein Rokan, who look at how party spaces, as they call, freeze right after World War I. In other words, how social cleavages lead to a formation of the party topography of Western countries. They only look at these that, in fact, are relatively stable. And it's a seminal piece. And so following that, I argue that the sports space of these countries are relatively stable. Next story, basically, is the second globalization. Some of this starts to change. And it starts to change in the course of the 80s, 90s, and so on, of which new technologies are absolutely essential. And also, basically, that time and space has become differently negotiated. So, for example, being a huge soccer fan, because, of course, this is one of my languages I learned early, when Sonia and I were very close friends, it was very hard for me to pursue this passion because I had to go to the kiosk in Harvard Square and wait for La Gazzetta dello Sport, which was, I don't know, 2 weeks late, and it was it was a chore. Okay, you had to kind of go down there, get the paper, find out. Today, this is totally meaningless. Today, I can follow every team, everything the way you can do in its location. So the question then, what the book is trying to look at is, are these old sports spaces being broken up? Or are they being sort of undermined in both directions? So, in our sports space, so to speak, the entrance of soccer, which, as we argue, has, since the earlier book, become Olympianized. What do we mean by this? Mean by this is that today, the World Cup, meaning a quadrennial event, has become part of quotidian American sports culture. It's water cooler talk. People know it. People follow it. Sonia Michel doesn't follow it, but knows that it's happening. No.
Should follow it.
No. You should. There's no should here, Sonia. It's fine. This is a voluntary gig. No. Okay. But she knows of its existence, whereas I'm reasonably certain that in 1978, when I took the two Miliband boys to watch the World Cup coming from Argentina, I never forget this. David was 13, Ed, now the leader of the Labor Party, 8, and we went to the Music Hall in Boston, which was this run-down movie theater, stench, urine, it's a horrible place, and this is where the World Cup was broadcast, closed-circuit television. No one knew this. It was like this closed society. You walked in there, and you had all these Italians from the North End, and shooting flares. I was terrified about the Miliband boys and the future of the Labor Party. You emerged, and no one knew this, even at the fancy schmancy Euro-centered Center for European Studies at Harvard, with which I was affiliated at the time. I said, Andy, where are you going? I'm watching the World Cup. The World Cup? What is that? Said, well, in Europe, which you're studying, they play this game. It's there. People go to this. Really. This was unknown. It's not the case anymore. The point is, and just like when I just finished teaching this big sports course in Vienna, I had a number of students in the lecture hall who came in with Green Bay Packers paraphernalia, and I queried them whether this was actually only transmitted by virtue of hip-hop or so on. No, they actually knew the Packers. They knew about the NFL. They know the NBA. They follow it. Okay? So the question then is, how much is this sort of broken up, or what is the the changing nature in these languages. Last point. Again, in the book, we actually argue very emphatically that to us sports are profoundly, because they're so meritocratic, profoundly enlightening or profoundly democratizing, precisely because you want the best of the best. Okay? And this, of course, causes, Hegelians as we are, a counter movement to it, namely what we call counter-cosmopolitan, actually borrowing Kenneth Apia's famous term, in which you have very defensive measures that try to protect or try to sort of obey or not permit this cosmopolitanism to really come to the fore. And this we discuss in great detail. Again, Frank knows this. In fact, we cite him numerous times about this, sort of the ugly underside of this cosmopolitan world of high achievement sports, which we, in fact, see as profoundly enlightening. Maybe in the Q&A period, I can, of course, say something else about this second globalization, which, of course, coincides massively with the second wave of feminism. Namely, that this world that I just described on both sides of the Atlantic and these languages were until now heavily male. In fact, like few others have. And what has happened, especially, by the way, in the United States, but elsewhere as well, is that women have entered this world, this discourse, certainly on the production side, where women are virtually men's equals in terms of numbers. But in terms of the consumption side, meaning following the sport, speaking it, living it, thinking about it all the time, in fact, it's still quite different. And if you want, we can have a nice discussion about this new ESPNW or in fact, my whole new research in which I argue that this is the last bastion of separate but equal. It's the only place, I mean, again, correct me if I'm wrong, we know that women, feminists have demanded that the president be a woman, and certainly the president of Harvard or Michigan or Brown or Penn so are women. I do not know of any feminist demanding that the quarterback for the Green Bay Packers be female or that the back four of AC Milan be women. In other words, that in this context, actually, race relations fall. I think homophobia has not yet. So again, this notion of inclusiveness or in a form of democratization, but yet the gender divide is indeed massive, certainly on the part. It's the only one where, it would be unthinkable to have a female and male physics department at Michigan. It's not unthinkable to have a female and male sports program. Okay, I think I'll stop here. And Frank.
Thank you.
So I'm going to pick up with where you started off by talking about how we met. Your invocation of Yiddish, I will connect to our first meeting, which was when I was working on my book. I was very intrigued with a lot of the same questions that you write about in your book about the relationship between globalization and the way in which the world was getting smaller and the way in which becoming a soccer fan had become so much cozier and we had access to this media and our fanship was fundamentally transformed. And the ways in which local traditions and customs and rituals and tribal allegiances still persisted in that atmosphere. And I think we came to pretty similar conclusions about the relationship between globalism and tribalism or counter-cosmopolitanism. But I'd come and I'd visited you not just because I was I wanted to bow in homage before the great academic scholar of the game and the person who had been making these connections that were very similar to the ones that I was very interested in between the game and global politics and global and sociology, but also because you knew something about Vienna in the 1920s, and I was very interested in a team that had played in Vienna in the early part of the century that was called Hakoah. And Hakoah was part of the Jewish sports movement that flourished as part of Zionism in the early part of the century. That one of Zionism's original goals was to try to deflect many of the anti-Semitic stereotypes that had flourished at the time. And in fact, some of the leading theorists of early Zionism were both people who put forward some of the more pernicious stereotypes of Jews and then set about trying to rebut them. And one of those was a guy named Max Nordau, who wrote a book about degeneration and about the way in which Europeans were getting soft in the age of industrialization. And in a lot of his depictions of the way in which Europeans were getting soft was very eerily similar of the descriptions of the ways in which Jews represented this effete, ghettoized population that was bookish but not capable of physically competing in the same sort of way, that they were less manly than their Goyish counterparts. And so Zionism decided that they was going to counteract this stereotype by taking it to the Goys by actually creating their own sports teams. And so they created in Vienna and in Budapest and throughout Austria and in parts of Germany a Jewish sports movement. Some of these were affiliated with political sports movements that even if you go to Israel today, there are teams that grow out of this moment. That there's the labor Zionist Hapoel clubs, there's Beitar, which is the Jabotinskyite revisionist clubs, and Maccabi, which is kind of the more mainstream Jewish sports movements. And in Vienna, where Andy has deep connections, was a club called Hakoah, which won the Austrian national championship in the mid-1920s, which was quite a feat because at that you wouldn't necessarily know that Austrian football is one of the global giants of the game now, but at the time it was respected as kind of one of the real cauldrons of soccer. And
Can I just interject?
No,
It's
please.
It's actually because to confirm this, Hakoah actually is the first continental club to beat an English club on the island. Hakoah beat West Ham United 4-3. Although, in fairness and the truth be told, West Ham actually did not have its first team run on the field. So,
well, that's a qualifier, which, for the sake of
24.
Okay.
And so I was curious in learning about this tradition from Andy, and it was in the story of Hakoah was incredibly dramatic, where they'd won the championship at the very last game in extremely dramatic fashion, where players were getting carted off for injury, and there was no ability to make there was no rule that allowed for substitutions in that game, and so you had players playing way out of position. I went and I did some. I wanted to try to find out what happened to this club and to this tradition within Hakoah. I mean, it was clear how it branched out and survived within Israel. And I went to the Holocaust Museum, where there's an amazing documentary that the Nazis produced about Theresienstadt, which was the Potemkin concentration camp that they created outside of Prague in order to convince the rest of the world that their concentration camps weren't so bad. And in the middle of this, there's footage of a soccer game being played in a courtyard where the skill level was extraordinarily high. And it was just a very resonant moment because I had known that a number of the players from Hakoah had been shipped off to Theresienstadt. And then in kind of very unintentionally ironic sequencing of events in the film, the next scene after the soccer scene is a scene of the showers at Theresienstadt, and a number of the players were killed by the Germans in various camps. So I'd gone to Andy in pursuit of this, and then more broadly, I was in pursuit of each chapter in my book. I tried to take on some big theme in the way that, kind of the same way that Andy does here. And so I had a chapter about how soccer explains the Jewish question. And I was intrigued by this because if you go to Ajax, which is the main team in Amsterdam and the great historic team in Dutch soccer, their fans will fly Israeli flags. And I remember you telling me a description of watching big Dutch blonde beer guts with Stars of David painted on their forehead. And if you go to many European cities, there are teams that are identified as the Jewish team. In London, the North London team, Tottenham, is known as the Yids or the Yiddos, and their opponents taunt them in that sort of way. Roma, in one of the two great teams in Rome, is known as the Jewish team. Bayern Munich, which is the historically dominant team in the German Bundesliga, is known as the German team, as the Jewish team. And I was incredibly fascinated by how a lot of these this identity as being a Jewish club could continue to persist in modern, enlightened, democratic societies, and how a lot of the rituals and the language, if you will, of these clubs managed to survive into this era. And some of it is quite brutal. That Ajax's opponents in Feyenoord tend to taunt them in very anti-Semitic ways. They say, Hamas, Hamas, Ajax to the Gas. Or I'm making that rhyme work, even though and then Tottenham's fans did the same sort of thing where they would call them the Yids and the Yiddos. And I was curious about the history. The history of this persistence varies from place to place. With Tottenham, in order to get to their stadium at White Hart Lane, you have to go through a Hasidic neighborhood, and so it was kind of an obvious thing for fans to taunt them with. Was their but at a certain point, Tottenham fans decided that they would take this insult and turn it into a badge of honor, and so they started to proudly call themselves the Yids and the Yiddos, and their fans will fly Israeli flags on occasion. And with these other clubs, there was a historic association with either having Jews on their boards of owners, or that the clubs existed in Jewish neighborhoods. And there's the Dutch, which became the Dutch national team in the late 60s and especially in the 1970s, reinvented the game of soccer. And the icon of this period was a guy named Johan Cruyff, who very proudly embraced the team, the Ajax's Jewish identity. And in fact, if you go to Israel now, there's a whole series, there's a whole mythology built around Cruyff actually being a Jew and marrying into a Jewish family. And people claim that they've seen this guy walking down the streets of Tel Aviv wearing a yarmulke, which I think is made up. But what wasn't made up was that this team in the late 60s, 1970s, took on a lot of Yiddish patter in its dressing room, and they had a Jewish masseur, and they would tell Jewish jokes, and actually kind of a loving sort of not anti-Semitic jokes, but like Jewish types of jokes, and that there was kind of a philo-Semitism that this team had embraced in arguably much the same sort of way that the Tottenham had, where they kind of took something that had been an association and then had become an insult, and then they kind of turned into a badge of honor. But anyways, I just bring up this small parable, not just because it was the time that I met Andy for the first time, but also because I think that it tells you a little bit about his thesis, which is about the ways in which, despite globalization, despite all the ways in which we've moved into a world that's dominated by Sky Sports broadcasting Manchester United and Real Madrid, and the ways in which we've all been sold essentially the soccer equivalents of Walmart and McDonald's, that you have these rituals and customs and tribal allegiances which should have disappeared in history, but they somehow managed to persist. And I think what Andy gets at is the way in which they're both the same side of the same coin. That the way in which the homogenization of the world propels us, in a lot of instances, to cling more tightly to these ancient customs and traditions. And I couldn't agree with Andy more that this game has been at the vanguard of globalization. That it has been kind of a laboratory for studying the way in which people's identities will shake out in this new age. And just thank him for applying the rigor that he has to studying this and coming up with so many interesting observations. And also, again, I'd be remiss if I didn't nod in the direction of Grant Wall, who is the dean of American soccer journalists and a king of Twitter, and somebody who knows probably infinitely more than I do. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Farkim. Okay, we can open the floor for discussion. We have some mics, portable mics going around. If you'd like to ask a question, please identify yourself and ask your question. Back here, let me introduce my colleague, Ken Hughes, who is a world-renowned rugby player in his own right.
Unfortunately, not world-renowned. But I was thinking about how the whole world seems to play British games, but different British games in different countries. So rugby is a religion in New Zealand, but hardly played in India. Very popular in Japanese universities, but just entering China. What accounts for the absorption of different British games in different countries?
Great question. Let's start with the export. Let's start first soccer versus rugby first. Okay. It accounts. What accounts for it is the relationship between Britain and the recipient country. So, for example, if you look at the countries that became cricket countries, they learned them from, it was actually directly ruled by Britain. And who played it? It was basically the administrative class, the educated officers, and so on and so forth. By the way, in my book, the greatest sports book ever written is called, by C.L.R. James, called Beyond a Boundary. It's totally brilliant. What is he showing? This great Barbadian, I think, or Trinidadian Marxist, who intellectual living in London. What is he arguing? He shows how this completely sort of stylized game, in which actually not only is time more or less irrelevant because you play for either 3 days or 5. Of course, the aristocrats don't have to worry about a clock. Okay. Moreover, of course, aristocrats also make sure that the hoi polloi don't participate. So, for example, the British aristocracy invents the whites. Okay, the working class was very hard to, the jerseys would get soiled, and clearly it was expensive for people to. So tennis and cricket actually remains white. Okay, it's clearly, and the whole amateurism is fascinating, which is invented as a form of exclusion, and then, by the way, interestingly, legitimized in the form of some kind of Greek myth, that the ancient Greeks were amateurs, which they were not. They were actually quite well paid for their athletic abilities. But the point being that what he shows is that this game actually becomes the cultural, what I call hegemonic culture, hegemonic sports culture. I mean, that people live by, talk, whatever, in all of the West Indies. In other words, how this completely aristocratic game becomes actually part of for the indigenous population. Moreover, what he also brilliantly points out, it's a kind of Gramscian analysis of cultures, it's brilliant. He shows how, in fact, on the cricket pitch, okay, on the ground, actually, there is, and this is what we mean by sports being profoundly meritocratic. What happens is that when these indigenous people, actually the players, are accepted as great cricket players, they are in fact the players' equal. Not in anything else, but on the field they are. Okay, so to answer your question, basically in the countries in which Britain ruled directly, it's either rugby, and by the way, rugby union, and cricket, because both are played by the British upper class. Rugby, as you well know, is as it's with a great saying, it's rugby is a rough sport played by gentlemen, and football, or the association game, is a gentle sport played by ruffians. I can go into reasons why, in fact, the association game very quickly becomes working class. It has something to do, actually, I mean, the reason why actually the association code, namely the kicking game, becomes the majority. I always discuss the split in 1863, very analogous to the 1903 split in the Russian Social Democratic Party between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. Okay? I'm talking about just size, not what they were saying. The Bolsheviks become the those that become this football association, namely those that see the game as primarily one of finesse, of dribbling, less of strength. The minority splits and forms its own version in 1871, the Rugby Football Association. And rugby football, because of its maintenance of amateurism, remains upper class. So, for example, the only vague semblance of any kind of college sports, which, by the way, is uniquely American. We have a whole chapter on this. This is fascinating. Okay, this huge entity called, I mean, millions follow this, unknown. The only thing that Oxford and Cambridge play at each other, they row since 1829, and they play rugby at Twickenham Park, which is kind of a fairly big deal, but nothing like BCS and what goes on here in terms of, okay? So, that explains the cricket and the rugby part of things. In other words, soccer is, as I said in my brief comments, is really bespeaks Britain's economic might, not its political might.
Can I?
Yeah, by all means.
I just while I have you here to ask the question and refine it slightly. So you have a whole chunk of the world in Asia that basically was largely immune to soccer, right? So that in China, which had kind of the soft economic relationship with Britain that you're describing, and then in India that had it certainly had soldiers and railway workers and all sorts of people who would have played the game passing through, and that's the way that the game was transmitted in large parts of the world, right? Is that No,
different. Yes, they are, but it's German or Brazilian textile workers who go to England and pick up the trade and come back. In India, you have the Brits who are there.
Right.
And they actually do not play soccer. And above all, the people look up to the local Brits who are the various potentates, the judges, whatever, who actually are not from the world of the soccer, are not from association football, but either rugby, because of course they went to Oxford and Cambridge, or cricket.
But certainly there were railway workers or soldiers who were playing the game, and we all know about the game's magnetic appeal. And once you watch it, how can you resist?
That I don't buy.
Okay.
I mean, I agree with you, but that's like saying, it's what I call, it's the rhapsodization of language. In other words, to us, it's, if you are speaking well, I know. I really think, I'll give you actually an interesting article by Jason Kaufman and Orlando Patterson, who in my book is one of the great interpreters of American society and also of race relations. And they actually picked up the Markovitz question of why is there no soccer in America, and they said, why is there no cricket in Canada? Which is a very interesting case because it's an exception to your question, right? I mean, political science, good socialists always think in exceptions. Why is there not this? And the argument they show is that unlike in these other, like Australia, New Zealand, wherever cricket becomes hegemonic, in Canada, the cricket players actually did not do what C.L.R. James describes in his great book about the West Indies. In other words, they maintained it as completely socially exclusive. It was a bastion of Britishness not linked to anybody else. And they argue that it may have something to do, in fact, of the extolling of Britishness as a kind of fighting off any kind of French influences. Okay, so it's a great article on the American Journal of Sociology, which looks at this exception. I just wanted to add one additional point to Frank's statement about this counter-cosmopolitanism, and again, American exceptions. What we find interesting is that in a country which by virtually all measures doesn't have necessarily more crime, as Peter Baldwin's great book about American Europe shows, but certainly much more violence, What is interesting is that these counter-cosmopolitan, these deeply vile, racist things actually that are part of European football across the board are absent in the United States. I think this is a very interesting question. The only thing that we could find is that in America you have some form of what is known as celebratory violence, which is actually odd in and of itself. In other words, when you win, the Lakers win the championship, then some cars are burnt down, or Ohio State beats Michigan. It's not when they lose, but when they win, that there is sort of some kind of they trash the local. But what you don't have is basically Frank's book. You don't have the just now, this Saturday, a wonderful German journalist came with me to the, and I will not talk about that game because it hurts me deeply, our loss to Iowa. But what he was totally surprised by is that, in fact, there were Iowa fans walking down with Michigan fans, and actually some of them were holding hands even, girlfriend, whatever. This is unthinkable. And he also, what he said, it was phenomenal atmosphere, but what he missed, what he said, there was no derision. He said, where are the chants? Where are the making, where is your in your face? The Michigan fans are upset, but they're not taunting the Iowa quarterback. What is going on here?
I'm from Philadelphia. We're very proud of our taunting the rights of culture.
Nah, but not to the same degree. Anyway, but
yeah, it's
okay.
It's pretty scary to be a Washington Redskins fan walking into Veterans Stadium.
And it should be.
Yeah. Can I give you my theory on this?
Yeah, absolutely.
My theory is that it has to do with the fundamental way in which clubs are organized here. That what's the greatest thing you could say about an NFL team is that it's America's team, and that the Washington Redskins, who do they represent? They represented the entire American South at one period in history, and so all the incentives were on for these teams to acquire very, very broad identities in order to have very broad appeals. Whereas in most European or Latin American cities, there are multiple teams within any given city, so you go to Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo has a team called Portuguesa, which is the team of the Portuguese immigrants. They have Palmeiras, which is the team of the Italian immigrants. They have Corinthians, which is self-consciously the team of the working class. They have Sao Paulo Football Club, which is self-consciously the team of the elite. And so when these guys play any match, there's always some explicit social relationship conflict that's being played out. I mean, the same is true. That's an exaggerated example, but the same is true in London and in Vienna and
Budapest. Yeah. We hypothesize that. I agree with you. And also, of course, these clubs often have not only a class or social dimension, but also political, religious, as you well know.
Can I offer you my theory?
Yes.
We don't do that with the sports field. We do that in politics. We denounce each other in politics.
Oh no, but that Europeans do too. I mean, just look at the question, the Prime Minister's question. So, anyway, I'm sorry.
Anyway, more questions. Yes, over here.
Dave Rogers, independent scholar and non-sports fan. I've heard it said that the reason soccer did not catch on professionally in the United States is that it cannot be interrupted for commercials. Would that be a fair assessment?
I would say no, because it precedes to me, in this case, I'm a very historically oriented social scientist. So to me, basically, if you don't make it into the sports space by 1920, the barrier of entry becomes huge. Now, where you are right is that, in fact, the structures there later make this barrier much harder. But you really have to go way before that, and well before television. So I agree that, in fact, today, or with the fact that you have the interruptions in American sports that you don't have in soccer, might be a bit of a barrier, but that's not how it started. In other words, you'd have to kind of clearly explain the historical absence of it.
And there's lots of counter evidence to suggest that American media is very interested in monetizing the game, and they don't really care about the structure of the game. In the 70s, ABC paid the North American Soccer League an enormous amount of money for the television rights, and in fact, they were probably just a little bit ahead of their time and too aggressive in promoting the game. And then certainly ESPN now seems to think that it can make gobs of money off of broadcasting the game, and evidence seems to suggest that they're right.
So just the last second. So the point is that if you, in fact, if enough people actually learn the language, so to speak, and actually become conversant with it, it doesn't matter.
Well, dumb question then. Why did soccer not catch on before 1920?
It's not a dumb question at all. I wrote a book on this. So I hope it's not a dumb question because very briefly, because the United States actually created 4, or certainly 3.5, but let's say 4 with hockey, languages, and it created its own football code. Okay? Just like Australia created, or actually Australia's a fascinating, just like Queensland created Australian rules football, and Victoria created Australian rules football. Queensland actually, and New South Wales created rugby league. So once a football code becomes hegemonic, it's very difficult for another to succeed. It has also something to do with, it really disappears. Again, blame it. Seamus Mallon, who used to be a very fine commentator for ESPN, and he worked at Harvard in the international admissions office for a very, very long time, wrote a great article in Harvard, the alumnus magazine, called "Blame It on Harvard," in which he argues that, in fact, had Harvard joined the Rutgers, this is one of those counterfactuals, but had Harvard joined Yale and Rutgers and Princeton and Columbia and Wesleyan and all these other East Coast schools who in fact played this more or less kicking game, because it's still early time, there was quite a bit of hybridity, the college world would have become a bastion of American, it would have been soccer-like, and not, Walter Camp would not have transformed it, would have not transformed, tailorized American rugby into American football.
Yeah. Thank you. Philippa Strum from the Wilson Center. I'm really interested in your discussion of globalization on the one hand and tribalism on the other hand. And I'm wondering how you deal with the question of multiple identities. That the implication on the one hand seems to be, well, globalization, we're all in the soccer or whatever it is thing together. On the other hand, there's tribalism, because obviously we've got other identities as well. And it makes me, this may be going a little bit beyond what you've written, but I'd be interested in hearing how you would deal with the question of, at what point might the commonalities overwhelm the multiple identities? And what would we have to do to get there? Because there's great potential in that. You talk about language, sports being a language, which suggests a method of communication, right? Go ahead. Sorry.
But just, I didn't mean to interrupt, because I think it's a great question, but go ahead. Are you? Look, just because, it's both. It's constantly both. The fact that we speak the same language, I hate to, if the normative direction of your question was that can this be kind of kumbaya and can it lead us to sort of loving each other, I'm very skeptical. All it means is that we understand, and you can create, and you're totally right, these are multiple identities that work at the same time. Let me give you an example. I'm absolutely convinced that hegemonic sports speak is probably the only real common language for heterosexual males. Okay? Meaning that an educated Michigan professor lands in London, is picked up by a cab at Heathrow and goes to the airport, or goes down to downtown London, and spends a phenomenal time of real bonding talking about Arsenal. Now, of course, I will not betray to him that I hope Arsenal, is hit by the pox and disappears, because, of course, he would jettison me and kill me or something. But we have the commonality. We actually know the history. We talk about it. There's a clear form, and clearly over class and culture, which creates this. The ditto with, Boston Red Sox or Boston. So clearly these are multiple identities that are, in fact, activated at different points in time. So yes, you can have, you're an Arsenal fan, you are a Londoner, and you thereby enter into a common language with someone coming from a different, but this does not necessarily mean, it's an empirical question, when this leads to a form of harmony. It also can lead to a form of division. Sonia kindly mentioned the Karl Deutsch, who was my mentor and hero, and I had the honor to name my chair after him. Karl Deutsch shows beautifully how language, in this case German, Czech, he looks at the various sort of nationalities, nationalism and social communication, how language can be tying and how it can be basically killing. So it's not a clear, just because people understand the language of soccer or baseball or basketball, the NBA, does not necessarily mean that, they agree. They might understand it, they might understand history, but they might actually think, that your affect. See, here's the point. On intellect, it's binding. On affect, it need not be.
There's a different model that we could look at, which is that we talked about how say Rome has two teams. There's Roma, which represents the inner city left, and there's Lazio, which has certain connections to Benito Mussolini and represents the kind of the outer rings of the city and represents the right, and they represent different social classes. And when they play each other, they're quite often, the Stadio Olimpico needs to be shut down because they just can't coexist in the same stadium. But when the Italian national team plays, you can find a way to get these guys to put aside their ideological class, geographic differences to support the national team. And so you might even find Lazio players cheering on Francesco Totti, who is the iconic player of Roma. You might not. But there are also examples of these rivalries, these tribal rivalries being so intense that you can't put them aside even to support some sort of greater national tribal rivalry. And so in the case of Scotland, you have two teams in Glasgow, Celtic and Rangers. Celtic is the team of the Irish Catholic immigrants, and Rangers is the team of Protestant Scotland. And every time they play, it's as if the Protestant Reformation is being fought all over.
1609, the battle, or 1680, whatever.
Yeah, they chant about the Orange Revolution and the Protestants wished that the potato famine kept on going. But they just can't find a way to support the national team, and so the national team becomes this kind of third transcendent national identity there. And even in Italy, you have Southerners and Northerners who don't really feel like they're part of the same country, and so they have a hard time bonding over the national team. And so people consider their local tribal allegiances even more meaningful and intense than their national allegiances, and can't get all that excited to embrace that kind of transcendent identity, even though it's so much fun.
But actually, just to take it further, I would say, picking up what Frank says, that I told Grant this today, even though I've been to 6 World Cups, I actually really dislike it. Because, in fact, this does not transcend difference. It just puts it onto a different scale. Because suddenly the difference, the conflict line is not between Roma and Lazio, or between Celtic and Rangers, but between Italians and everybody else. And I actually find that, again, it's a global thing, but in fact it heightens nationalism. It causes we, by definition, becomes that of the nation. A bit of inebriation, suddenly the German fan does not sing the third stanza of the German national anthem, which of course is the official one, Einigkeit und Recht und Freiheit, and very quickly it degenerates into Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. Okay? So the point is that your point that in fact, yes, the local, the commonness has just been jettisoned one step higher to a level that I actually really find problematic. And in fact, I would argue that, and as we do in the book, and this has actually caused some people have criticized this, which is great. I think that clubs in general who are, or teams who are actually only in the business of really winning. From the Cincinnati Red Stockings in 1869, the first professional entity only one of them was from Cincinnati. The rest were from all over. Meaning that, in fact, the logic of winning, okay, the logic of excelling, and which, by the way, can be measured. This is so important to sports. We can actually say who is the best last year in American football was the New Orleans Saints, period. Now, they won luckily, whatever, but this is clear. You can't say this in virtually any, who's the best neurosurgeon, who's the best, we don't know this. There are many who are good, or, some people, now, of course, Americans are generally, of course, totally obsessed with ranking, which, of course, bespeaks a lack of which is great in part. I mean, obviously, if you don't have an aristocratic culture, you have to measure everything. Oxford and Cambridge don't rank. Harvard and Yale start already ranking, and that's also the origin of college sports. The origin of college sports has everything to do with product differentiation. Okay? When in 1874, Columbia wins the regatta on Lake Winnipesaukee, President Barnard just goes nuts. Glory to the Columbia men. You've created a greater awareness of the university and in the physics department. It's just like, and the next year, President Andrew White from Cornell does the same. So in fact, this kind of identification with teams and your college pride has everything to do with, we want the best English department and also the best whatever. And this is clearly something very competitive, and I would argue also inherently meritocratic. Okay? In the national team, who belongs to the Inter Milan fielded in the last time they won the European Championship, the treble, they had not one Italian on the team, actually on the starting team. I think this is great. Not one. Argentinians, Romanians, whatever. And the Austrian commentator whom I watched in Vienna always said, D'Italiener, D'Italiener. I said, it's not the Italiener. It's maybe the Milanesen, but it's not the Italiener. Okay? And that's my own normative bias. I'd much rather have a fandom associated with Inter, this great team, which is really cosmopolitan, than with the Italian national team, whose entrance is by definition a passport, which means some kind of identity, and it immediately becomes, I'm actually studying, I told Grant, I'm looking at all these the national anthems that are being sung and how this has become it's a new thing of my time, people just stood around. Now they're all holding each other, they're making all kinds of weird this. It's this complete nationalism of a very odd nature, which I personally, being an internationalist, I find it very, troubling.
It's my favorite part of the game.
There we go.
Yes.
Is it? Yeah, I love it. I find it really emotional.
Okay.
Alan Levine, American University, an obnoxious Philadelphia fan. I have two interrelated questions. I think about sport and egalitarianism. And so, one, Andy, in your talk, you mentioned that when the different British sports came to America, that they were sort of adapted in a Tocquevillian kind of way. And does that mean that they, in fact, became more egalitarian? That's my first question. Mm-hmm. And can you just explain that a little bit? And the second has to do with the subtitle of your book, How Sports Are Reshaping Global Culture a global politics and culture, right? So sports are the active agent here.
Yes.
And it's a lot easier for me to see how sports are reshaping culture in the kind of meritocratic, egalitarian way in which you've been talking about. It's a lot harder for me to see how sports are reshaping politics, because during this whole sports trend and maybe general egalitarian trend, politics is all over the place,
yes.
right? And especially in Latin America, where you talked about.
Yes.
So it doesn't seem to me that. So can you explain more how the sports shape politics?
Let me start with this, and I give you the email of my Princeton editor, and I want you to write her just what you told me, because I did not want the word politics in there. I did not, because precisely of what you said. And she, of course, insisted that obviously for two reasons. One is because, I don't know, she thought maybe it can get two political scientists to buy the book. But second, because, of course, hailing from a Department of Political Science, it would give me a more legitimacy. I could not agree more with you. The book doesn't do it doesn't do a good job at all, and I totally agree with you that in fact it's really an issue of society and culture. What we do, I think, fairly well is showing that the power of these teams and of these languages is it's really Bourdieuian. It's really about it's about culture. It's not economic, and I'm doing a very poor job about. I totally concede you the point, but I think what we do is people always associate this with lots of money. It's not a lot of money. The Yankees and Manchester United are both at $2 billion. I looked into it. In Michigan, there are 18 companies with a market capitalization over $2 billion. 30 some have annual sales bigger. This is just in Michigan alone. These teams are actually mid-sized to small entities, despite Snyder and what people. That's not their power. Their power is really one of culture, and and their power is immense. People do love the Redskins, are obsessing about this. If you do any kind of analysis in terms of how much you're preoccupied by them, okay? So the politics, you're totally right, because in fact, just let's take Germany. They played through the Kaiserreich. I mean, you can't have a more Weimar Republic, the Third Reich, straight on. In fact, Herberger is the national coach through the Nazi period straight into the Bundesrepublik, okay? So in fact, politics doesn't affect it. The other question is the making it American. Well, first of all, of course, there is one of the American sports which is actually profoundly American, namely, and in fact, one of it's like de novo, which of course is basketball. Basketball is sort of invented by one guy, more or less. And although there are earlier versions, for instance, the Dutch game, which later becomes korfball. By the way, an interesting game. It's the only one that I know of which has 4 men and 4 women on the team. Although there too, in the game itself, there is gender differentiation, because only the men can guard the men and the women can guard the women. Okay, because the only one I'm looking at this, which are other than actually equestrian and some yacht disciplines, there is complete gender separation. And basketball.
Mixed doubles and tennis.
There's mixed doubles and tennis, which, by the way, good point, which actually is constantly losing in its importance. But you're right, it's mixed doubles. The Tocquevillian part, is that so basketball is in fact an American invention. Actually, it's the Y. It's basically Dr. Naismith, who, by the way, of course, is a Canadian. And he creates basketball as this anti-football. If in football you can run with the ball, in basketball you have to put it on the floor to make it a non-contact sport, so to speak. But baseball actually wins out over cricket precisely by claiming that it is more American, that it is faster, that it doesn't take 3 to 5 days. This is before the 2020 that exists now. In cricket, that it's more democratic. Everyone comes to bat 3 or 4 times, and as we know, all sports, ultimately, the value of them is really, it's the offense that matters. So actually, if I were to suggest introducing a new sports language and its success, it's all offense. Okay? Offense attracts. Defense is for the poets, the people who really know the language. So I, for instance, when I have European visitors and we go to Comerica Park, I always hope that it'll be a home run fest, 13-15 or something, so they can really see a lot of offense. As a purist of the game, I would love for it to be a pitcher's duel. The same with Europeans. I love sometimes a 0-0 game, okay? But that bespeaks a very advanced level of proficiency in the language. And clearly baseball wins over cricket by it being more American, faster, more democratic, more, people come to bat more. Winning being that's actually very American. In cricket, cricket you didn't have to win. In fact, winning was quite relatively rare. Okay, there were many games that ended in a draw. This to Americans is
just give up out of boredom.
Well, you see, again, not to me, because again, I know the language. That's sure. But boredom. By the way, it's interesting how people always view any foreign of these languages. Number one, it's boring.
In cricket, that's subjectively true. I'm sorry to say.
See,
Anybody want to argue with me on that one?
Well, even if I'm alone, I disagree. In fact, I disagree. Secondly, that it is actually easy. Of course, it's boring because if you don't speak the language, everything, it's boring. Secondly, that it's easy. I mean, how hard, you hear this all the time, how hard can it be to hit a ball, with this bat? No, sure, a ball coming at 98 miles an hour doing funny things. It's easy. Or the other way, Americans saying, how hard can it be to kick a ball? Especially since you see little kids do this. Okay, it's very easy, it's natural. Trust me, very hard. To me, these sports heroes are all actually highly qualified, skilled workers. Very qualified skilled workers, or actually even artisans, if not even artists. Okay? And then the third, which is interesting, I'm sure, for Sonia, it's almost always somehow not manly enough. Okay? In other words, the derision or the put down of the rival language is that it's somehow not tough enough. Including, by the way, this wonderful thing about that the NFL, with the English working class actually finding it sort of a patsy sport, which watching any NFL game, you must be a lunatic to think that this is a patsy sport.
Well, they do wear helmets.
Exactly. So real men don't wear helmets. They don't wear padding.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Can I just say one thing? I mean, there is, all right, it's maybe sports aren't reshaping global politics, but it's just like any object of popular passion, politicians are kind of ridiculous not to try to attach themselves to it. And also, we do have the one prominent example where the Prime Minister of Italy became a national figure because he was president of AC Milan, which was a club that he took from being kind of at the time, a middling enterprise into being the great power of European soccer. And he rode that all the way.
So actually, this part of the book, this is exactly what Clara did. She said, Andy, it is about politics, because we mentioned just this, that in fact...
See, he earned it.
Yeah, but it's still, Alan's point
Well, the
stands.
question is whether sports are a vehicle for politics.
Right.
Or they shape politics.
Right.
I mean, it's the direction.
Exactly,
It's
and
the
they
question of
definitely,
direction.
but they used not to be. For example, when the Germans won in '54, Adenauer didn't even, an amazing victory. Which is really the beginning of the modern Federal Republic. There's a great book called the Gründung, the foundation of the Federal Republic of Germany, and the Wankdorfstadion in Bern on the 4th of July, no less. And Adenauer doesn't even congratulate these guys. I mean, this is unthinkable. Today, Angela Merkel is on the plane constantly. When I was at the Euro in '98, she was in every second game. The Germans are playing. You're there. Tony Blair stops a cabinet meeting because of Beckham's foot in the 2002 World Cup. So in the meantime, it has become, and of course in the United States, it's always been, president throwing out the first pitch, Barack Obama hanging out in the booth of the All-Star game with what's the name, Tim McCarver and whatever schmoozing. So yes,
Grant palled around with Bill Clinton across the World Cup.
Exactly.
They still use it. I mean, like, maybe not as much as in the past, like the 1970 Brazil World Cup champion team, the military government used them to help build popular support. Pelé got upset because of that later on and refused to play in the 1974 World Cup.
Right.
In part because of it. Just last year, Honduras was going through a protracted coup and played the U.S. during that. And this country is very much divided, but the Honduran national team was in the process of qualifying for its first World Cup in almost 30 years. And so I interviewed the de facto ruler of Honduras, who was trying to, of course, use the success of the soccer team to bolster his own regime at a time which it wasn't being recognized by the United States. So it still happens. It happens. I don't know if it's shaping the politics. In some ways it's shaping it. In some ways it's also the politics trying to then to use the sports.
My favorite Pele politics soccer story is that the Brazilian Congress had declared Pele a non-exportable natural resource in order to prevent Juventus from buying the guy. And so when Warner Communications decided that they were going to start the North American Soccer League, and they desperately wanted Pele to come play in New York and to become the centerpiece of this whole operation, they had to contend with this law, and they had to get the Brazilians to change their mind. So what did they do? They had Henry Kissinger call the vice president of Brazil, because Henry Kissinger, as you point out in your book, is a tremendous soccer fan. And he called up and he told the vice president of Brazil, it would be in your nation's interest to let Pele come to the United States. And that was apparently enough to have the Brazilians lift that law. I don't think that Barack Obama or I don't think certainly not Tom Donilon or Jim Jones could have that kind of effect right now on Brazil, but
Right here.
Hi, Weston Malillo with the Wilson Center. I was just wondering if you could speak historically about how society has come to view sports figures as barometers for morality, such as the highly publicized Tiger Woods extramarital affairs were highly scrutinized, and I could even think of like Jackie Robinson and players like such as that who have been seen as good for society in that they've integrated things like that. And I was wondering why, if that's due to the proliferation of media technology or if that's due to increased popularity of sports in America, and maybe that's why there's no openly homosexual players in the NFL as opposed to an openly homosexual player in the rugby league in the UK.
Very new. Obviously, in my view, and actually we talk about this in the book, the Jackie Robinson event integrating is every bit as salient as, Brown v. Board of Education. But I mean, it's an iconic aspect, especially, by the way, of baseball. Because baseball at the time is really primus inter pares in America. And especially since the 1880s, where Cap Anson, who was the best player at the time, and decides to take his Cubs off and will never play with African Americans. And in fact, because you do have African American players in the NFL earlier, and in fact, Fritz Pollard in 1922 or 3 is the first African American coach. Now, of course, in a league which at the time was not important, because in fact, as I always in my football lectures say, that really until 1958 the NFL is unimportant. It's really the colleges that establish that game or that language in American history. So yes, I mean it's absolutely important. Branch Rickey, whose great grandson is my doctoral student at Michigan, I'm very, very pleased about that. Brilliant guy, actually. Clearly, Branch Rickey's, I think, genius was not that he, I mean, by the way, it's all driven by meritocracy. Okay, he's not a particularly I mean, he was not a rabid racist, but he was a regular guy at the time who was accepted the code. And he really looks at the Negro leagues, and he looked at the players, and he wanted the Dodgers to beat the Yankees and to recruit the best players, and clearly saw this as a market or as a potential to get players. Now it so happens taking Jackie Robinson, who was not the best player in the Negro leagues, although he was amazing athlete, lettered in 4 sports at UCLA, was that he took a guy with this kind of sort of fortitude whom he knew he had to have, because were he to ever react to the abuse that he was going to get, he would be killed. And that's, I think, what... And then, interestingly, look, first year, the MLB has Rookie of the Year is institutionalized, and he wins it. I mean, I don't think this would happen in any other métier that I know, where people who would be not allowed, and he actually, his achievement is so good that even this racist world votes him the first Rookie of the Year. This would not happen in academia or in medicine or in business or anything else, okay? The Tiger Woods look, I'm not so sure that this is so new. I mean, for instance, the great Austrian, Babe Ruth was already a huge, what do we call it? Who are transcendent, but also kind of over marketing. It's sort of that you are you're stepping into different realms. It'll come to me in a minute. And clearly
intertextual.
Yes. Okay, intertextual. Clearly,
Babe Ruth is intertextual. You heard that here first.
Yes, intertextual. And so clearly this exists. Or again, Viennese football, this guy Uridil in the 1920s becomes there's a song after him. And so there are, Stanley Matthews in England. So that you do have sports stars. Which kind of, I actually can't.
Crossover.
Thank you. Yeah, that's it. Crossover stars, absolutely. Who are clearly, of course, anchored in the excellence of this sport. And that pertains to this day. No one would care about Tiger Woods' social life, whatever, if he were not a sensational golfer. And back to Grant's wonderful book about David Beckham. It's very clear that David Beckham is the global star par excellence, and he is, to so many people, metrosexual, this, that, whatever. But all of this is predicated on the fact that he actually was or maybe still is, a very good player on the field. And if he loses this goes. Then it's just, So I would still think that the meritocracy of your output in the thing in which is really matters still, and in fact and then yes, we live in a different age where we follow public figures and their 9 to 5 life, 5 to 9 life more prolifically than we did before, whether politicians or rock stars or whatever.
I feel like sports is somewhat different than politics in that I think with politics. It's hard to imagine we'll have moments like the 2008 election where one politician is elevated into kind of a heroic sort of status, but mostly we think our politics are so broken, and it's hard for us to generate that type of feeling for politicians. But with professional athletes, as long as people keep playing the game of baseball, it doesn't matter how many juicing scandals or sexual assault scandals they'll have, we'll still turn our favorite players into heroic figures who,
as long as they perform,
right?
Exactly.
And we'll invest a certain amount of moral. It's not quite authority, but we'll believe that they're paragons of some sort of way.
Just to suggest something, a great book by my colleague Mikara Lavakmanti, a great political theorist at Michigan. He wrote, it's called The Playing Fields of Eton, in which he looks at, he has this chapter about PEDs, about what does equality mean, what does achievement mean. There's this amazing chapter in which he calls women and other handicaps, okay, in which he argues exactly this issue. And so I'm studying this with him now, about how much the output really is over sort of how much equality is outweighed, or when is excellence, in fact, if it's not performed according to certain rules, really dismayed. And this leads to the whole debate about, again, obviously, performance-enhancing drugs, which I am convinced that the only reason that we care so much about is we only care about the sanctity of the best of the best. In other words, what we really are upset about is not that.
Do you think there's a different European attitude than American attitude? Just looking at cycling, which everybody knows, every cycler is doping, yet nobody really cares. I mean, the sport still has pretty. I mean, maybe it's always a niche sport, but it's still, those people in that niche follow it fanatically.
I actually disagree with you that no one cares, although I also agree with you that everyone knows that it's completely ubiquitous. Look, excuse me, if you ride 3,000 miles for 3 days,
Right.
for 3 weeks.
I thought you were about to say it's boring, so you...
boring? Are you kidding me? I've followed the Tour de France since 1960. I can tell you every winter. No, they're not boring at all.
But in other words, you're saying you need something to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
On this flimsy machine, you need. I mean, when they asked Jacques Anquetil after his 5th Tour win, whether what we was using is, he said, "I did not win on Evian water." I mean, it's.
Marjorie, yeah.
I know we're winding up, but I just had something I had to ask, since it's so rare to get
Introduce
an opportunity. Marjorie Spruill, I'm a fellow here at the Wilson Center. I have the opportunity to ask questions of people who are astute analysts of culture, sports, and gender. If you could care to comment about the new phenomenon recently written up in the Washington Post called the Lingerie League, and if you can assure me that this would go away quickly as a phenomenon in American culture.
Are you familiar with the Lingerie League, Andy?
I actually am vaguely, but I can't. I can't guarantee that this will disappear. So, look, maybe we should meet. First of all, let's start with cheerleading. Cheerleading used to be totally male, and in fact, it started with those players who were not playing, and they were the bench guys, actually, who were cheering. Actually, you see some of this in the famous 1984 NBA Final, Game 7, when Larry Bird sort of cheers on his Celtics.
The towel wavers.
Exactly. So, in fact, it really starts in a completely asexual way. Clearly, body. This is all about body. And
what happens in the Lingerie League? I'm just.
It's.
Oh, you don't know about it?
No, I'm sorry to say. Don't.
There was this big story about it recently, and apparently some promoter has decided that they would take the most beautiful among truly talented female athletes and get them to play football in big stadiums, and they're wearing helmets and some slight shoulder pads, but other than that, they're wearing fancy ladies' underwear, right, including garter belts and stockings, and apparently are playing and making, professional, making really good money. And this is in Baltimore, I believe. Baltimore or Philadelphia one, I forgot. No one saw this article but me.
Trust me, no serious sports fan, this is ephemeral. But what isn't ephemeral, I think, so this is, I don't know, I knew this also, but no one, look at this, no one, Grant Wall lives in Baltimore, SI doesn't know, this is not in that sense a meaningful thing. It's like, mud wrestling, or basically, it's
the governor
disgusting, and look, if you, for instance, look at the New York Times Magazine a couple of weeks ago that featured women tennis stars.
Women hitting hard.
Women hitting hard.
Who hit hard.
And these are, Venus Williams, and above all, Kim Clijsters was on the cover. If you see this cover, it's a phenomenal photo, and it clearly is in some ways, it's not lingerie league, but it clearly is in some ways erotic, or there's some, she's sweating, her hair is all over the place. She's sort of even some sand on her. It's clearly, in fact, someone wrote about this. And what we call in the book the Kurnikova effect, meaning that, and I'm just stating to you what I've thought. I don't know whether one can get rid of this or how one could. Clearly by sport being linked to bodily prowess, okay? I think one of the reasons why academia hates it so much, but that's a whole other question, okay? It's about basically, so the minute that's the case, very adjacent to it, almost like a cousin, is clearly some form of beauty, sexuality, et cetera, et cetera. So...
Do you see ESPN, their last issue was the body issue, in which it was athletes who were both male and female posing suggestively. They were naked, but posing in suggestive. But there is something, I feel like there's an anxiety in sports about being... there's so many. It's probably a lot of complicated feelings within sports itself, where you have athletes who, obviously, like the big man on campus trope is the athlete as kind of hypersexualized figure, but then there's also some other, when you become just a machine, there's something kind of desexualizing about becoming just a collection of body parts in the way that your body... There's the one thing that I sensed coming out of this package and the willingness and enthusiasm with so many athletes posed naked was that it was almost as if there was an anxiety shooting through it. It didn't.
Yeah, but I
like
think it's very gendered. For the men, it's kind of a lark. For the women, it's not. So very quickly, for example, I'm totally honored that a major American female football star, Brandi Chastain, endorsed our book. And in fact, where I did win, again, where did I lose against my editor? That politics had to go in. Where did I win with my editor? I insisted that Brandi Chastain precede the legendary Peter Katzenstein. Those of you who don't know, a very, very eminent professor of political science at Cornell University. Okay, because I wanted Brandi Chastain. And what is she known for? Even though she's a phenomenal athlete, she is a great, great player. She's known for this, the famous bra. Everybody knows it. When I say to people, oh, she's the one, right? So, what I'm saying here is that...
If you do sports in a sexist society, sexism is going to triumph. It's going to trump them. So when women try to be just as good in their way at their sports, they still are coded as women.
But it's also, look, I really we should talk about this because I'm obsessed. I did a study of how women this is Michigan undergraduates, follow or construct sports similarly and differently. And for example, when it comes to Michigan football, there's no difference. None, zero. Because clearly that's their identity. They go to the games, they follow. When it comes to the Detroit Lions or something else, it's a difference. Clearly, for example, I'm very torn about this ESPNW thing. And so are these women who are real sports fans, because they say we have a sports network, it is ESPN. By making it already feminized. What does that mean? Do you follow the Yankees in a feminized way, or what exactly? And thereby you clearly are creating, so maybe the argument is that women watch it more as an exercise or more as a form of participatory. That's fine, but that already is getting away from the reason that we follow it. And by the way, also women follow it. So I took out... I always ask in my large sports class, I always enter, by now I have about 60 or so, I walk in and they're half and half women. I say, please, those women who watch ESPN Sports Center at least once a day, who watch Pardon the Interruption and watch other kind of these iconic sports shows, please identify yourself and write to me why this is the case. And out of about 100 women, about 10 each class write. And they follow sports as much as the guys do, and they know about it. And it's very interesting that their entry into this was so far invariably with some man, their dads, their brothers, their cousins, and they've become experts. But what is interesting is that when I then do further interviews, it's the only place where, to this day, even though they live with guys and they completely follow. The other day, someone told me, it's amazing what happened in the red zone for the Jets. To which her friend says, "How do you know this?" To which he says, "Because I'm watching, like you." The point is that in no other realm of their life are they still not taken as equals. They're equal in math and they're equal in politics. No one says, "Wow, how do you know what the Democratic Party is doing there?" They're equals there. But in this, they still are, even though they enter, all of them tell me that they never feel quite at ease. They constantly think that when they're watching a Sunday football game or whatever, and they're Jet fans or whatever, as this woman is, that when she watches with the guys, they're still kind of, when will she slip up? When will she say something that clearly betrays her? And this comes back, I think, to the gentleman's point. I think these are ultimately still immensely male preserves and heterosexual male preserves. And in fact, other than this rugby player, it's the Welsh guy you mean, right? Other than this rugby player who I do not know if, it's not only the NFL, I do not know of any major hegemonic team sports in which men, while playing, not afterwards, but while playing, have come out and admitted homosexuality. Not one. Okay? When in 1992 or so, a Chelsea player by the name of Graham Lassault, French Le, S-E-A-U-X, already to a good footballer lad, sort of an odd thing, Graham Lassault. He also read the broadsheets, and he also apparently liked wine, and he kind of went to a museum once in his life or something. This already, to your kind of beer guide, this is not acceptable. And of course, Robbie Fowler, good Liverpudlian, good Scally, as they're called, of course insulted him in a match between Chelsea and Liverpool, whereupon Graham Lassault had to, of course, prove his masculinity and kind of punched him or whatever, and he was, of course, banned for, 2 games or something, whatever. Okay? But the point was that he had to establish this. And I think this is, it's something deep. I think it's, I'm obsessed with this. And
Isn't it strange, given where the popular culture is at in general, about the way in which gays are portrayed on TV and in movies, that we're still probably 10 years away, it feels like, from having professional sports leagues that where there are players who are out? I mean,
shouldn't be. I mean, maybe, but I find it sort of very... look, it's also what's so interesting. It's also the only world where men are constantly physical. I mean, after every goal, they hug each other, they kiss, they take off their jerseys. But
that's exactly why.
Exactly.
That's exactly why.
Exactly, because they're beyond.
It'll be interesting to see which comes first. We finally integrate the military, or we finally,
That'll come first.
You think?
Yes.
Well, I don't
know.
But
it's also, by the way, the military is an important issue here, because it's not only the military, but really, to me, the military is a large bureaucracy. It's the question about fighting units.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
So when in my freshman seminar, I brought this up, and some of the guys just said, "Look, do you mean to tell me that Ray Lewis, do you mean Ray Lewis should really whack a woman running across the field if it's a mixed field? How can this be?" I said, "Why not?" Okay? I said, "No, because he would kill her, and also so the whole." It's a very deep issue. I think it has to be rethought in terms of the metrics of the game.
Well, a woman is not going to play football if she's not strong enough and big enough to I mean, it would be suicidal to do it. I mean, I meant when gays in the military, gays
Right.
come out in the military.
Right.
That's what
Right.
I meant. But I think there was one more question. Yeah, right here.
Thank you. I'm Mark Barker. I was lucky enough to be Professor Markovitz's student at Michigan a couple of years ago. And as usual, I have a very narrow, quick question for you. And you alluded to this a little bit, but are there general observations you have on the place of sports in societies undergoing rapid and radical change or revolution? Is the people that follow sports, the identities mixed into it, stay constant through revolution or change? Does it change in some kind of general ways?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by revolution or.
So, for example, if at the early part of the century, countries that became communist.
So
I see. Really overarching changes to society. Are there changes mirrored in the sports realm? General changes that you could observe. Quick, easy question as usual.
No, I think back to our response to Alan, I think what is interesting is that the fascination and the following of sport is actually relatively robust against changes in regimes. Okay? Now, what you do have is clearly, in this case, I know you studied China and the Soviet Union and the state socialist societies, the driving force becomes actually not the market or society, but the state. Although it's actually an interaction. For example, the Soviet ice hockey machine is linked to the prevalence of the game called banty, which actually is played in Russia and Sweden. So the reasons why the Soviets become so good is not only because of the red machine right after the war, but actually because they have these good banty players. A great book by Robert Edelman, the fine historian at UC San Diego, wrote a great book called On Spartak Moscow. He calls it the people's team in the worker state. And another book that I can suggest is the Munich Olympics of 1972. It says the making of modern Germany, in which you can clearly see how these mega events are linked to regimes, and obviously the Nazis and all the Olympics, clearly. But what I'm actually interested in is sports that people follow. So actually I'm interested in basically 3, 4, 5. They're all team sports played with some kind of ball-like contraption. So permit me to call a hockey puck a ball, okay? So I'm not interested in the Olympics. I'm not interested in thousands of other sports that actually people produce, okay? I'm interested in, these are the doers, and most sports have a profile of, if I had a board here, doers and followers are like this. They're almost identical, okay? All of them have their own culture. Badminton has its own culture. What I'm interested in is those few sports that really encompass a world who actually don't even know the sports. Okay, who you cannot live in New England without knowing the Red Sox. You can't. Unless you really are I don't know, you're absent somehow. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. I'm really interested in these few team sports. You cannot live in Europe without knowing these teams that we talked about. It's impossible, even if you don't know their players, their histories, any of this.
The thing you're alluding to about Spartak Moscow was the way in which the whole club structure in communist societies was built around the state and the various outposts of the state. So your Dynamo teams which
were secret police teams,
and Lokomotiv, which were affiliated with the railroad workers, and et cetera, et cetera. And so after communism, you did have, in sports in you had the state being replaced by oligarchs in a lot of these countries, and I think that did actually change the way in which people felt about the teams in some countries where there was kind of it was hard to root for state teams if you're a Ukrainian nationalist. To root for the state-run team that's affiliated with this apparatus is hard to do, and so afterwards, a lot of these clubs felt liberated, or people felt as if they were liberated, and that they could become proxies for their suppressed national ideals. And in some places, like the former Yugoslavia, it exploded to cataclysmic effect, where you had hooligans with various clubs actually turned into bands of genocidal maniacs who went marauding across across Bosnia.
In 1991, that famous
Yeah.
game between Dinamo Zagreb, the bad blue boys,
Yes.
and Red Star Belgrade, I would date this, in fact I do, when I teach my course on sort of post-communist Europe, as iconic in terms of the beginning of the civil or not civil war between the Serbia and Croatia. No question. Right. When Boban, the player for Dinamo Zagreb, actually kicks this policeman, it really becomes an act of Croatian defiance and Croatian national expression against the Serb-dominated Yugoslav, the JNA, the Yugoslav National Army.
But it's sort of a side question or another way of thinking about this. I mean, and you were saying you're interested in sports that people follow in large numbers. Is there some relationship between that and democracy? I mean, does that only occur within the context of a democracy?
No, because people follow. That's again back to people followed soccer in Nazi Germany, and people followed exactly these sports are followed. They're so powerful, I would argue, that they're actually regime resistant. Mm-hmm. So in fact, they renamed the Italian fascists renamed Inter Milan into Ambrosiana Milan, but they continue. And so yes, there's certain, but basically the game becomes so powerful that the Nazis, for example, hated soccer. And they tried to kind of change it. They actually banned the German president of Bayern Munich, German Jewish president, who, as interesting, of course, then goes to Switzerland, and the Bayern players actually visit him, and the Nazis are furious about this. But still, the game continues, and there's a championship, and people go to this, and the same with the Soviet Union.
So there is an association with democracy. I mean, if it's seen as something that's a resistance, a source of resistance to totalitarian.
But it's not a resistance. It's not only a resistance. It's also, in terms of its nationalism, it's something to be proud of. And as Grant pointed out, the 1970 win by the Brazilian team definitely helped the junta in Brazil, and the 1978 Argentinian victory, no question, helped the junta. I mean, so regimes use these sports, but not use these sports to buttress their legitimacy.
Right.
So in fact, it might be democracy. So Chris Young's book about Munich 1972 argues that it was an Olympic Games that should highlight and buttress the Federal Republic's democratic, its democratic being, just like 1936 highlighted the Nazi being.
Right. So it allows for claims to popularity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a form of legitimacy.
Yeah.
And that's exactly back to Berlusconi, who actually entered Italian politics by owning a team, and he names this party Forza Italia, named after Forza Milan, which basically says "Go Milan." And so he kind of uses this personalistic tie, which these clubs are, to kind of project onto the successful club. It's as if, don't worry, he's dead, but it's as if Steinbrenner were to parlay this to becoming actually president of the United States, or Jerry Jones or something.
Well, look what this woman is doing in Connecticut.
Yes.
I mean, she's trying to sort of now whitewash what the Women's Wrestling League did, and she claimed...
No, it's not the Women's Wrestling League. It's the world.
But there were women in it, too.
Yeah.
I mean, because somebody asked her about, how she felt about the fact that there were these women wrestlers, and it was kind of degrading. And she said, well, they've kind of upgraded. They've kind of
now it's
cleaned up their image.
Can you imagine if Daniel Snyder ran the United States?
Since I don't know who Daniel Snyder is, I can't imagine.
Owner
but
of the
Redskins.
Redskins.
Okay.
Yes.
We would be fighting so many needless imperial wars. I mean, because that's his attitude. The Deion Sanders war,
Oh well.
Well, we have fully explored, I think, the relationship between politics, policy, culture, and sports. Thank you very much to our two speakers. Please join us outside for whatever sandwiches are left, and there are books available for sale, and I'm sure Andy would be happy to sign them.
Oh,
thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. This was great.
Thank you both. It was
Thanks.
terrific.
It's terrific.
I learned a lot.
Yeah. I saw you took notes. It's great.
We have to write summaries, so.
You do have to write summaries?
Yeah, I'll give you a copy of our newsletter. Yeah, it's